for UPL, give a warm welcome, please, to Dr. Patrick Forscher. Dr. Forscher is here from the University of Arkansas to speak to you today about evaluating interventions to change social disparities. He is a first-year academic, so is an assistant professor who just finished his first year, actually, really cool. He did his PhD with Patricia Devine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As I said to many of you, Dr. Devine is an international renowned scholar in the area of prejudice reduction, which was great. He finished his PhD in 2016, then went on and did a postdoc for a year also with Patricia Devine. And now today he is published in a few great journals. You have some great publications. I enjoyed reading them. Thank you. I encourage many of you to read them as well. They're in JESP, JPSP, and Academic Medicine, which I thought was really cool. Anyway, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Forscher. Okay.
So it's now 60 years since the start of the civil rights movement, but disparities between social groups, particularly black people and white people, have lingered. And I'm going to give you a couple of these examples, but there are more of them. So compared to white people, black people are about 2/3 as likely to receive callbacks on the same resume, about 3.5 times as likely to be shot while unarmed by the police, and about half as likely to have their R01 grade proposals on. Like I said, there are more of these, but point being, since the civil rights movement, these disparities have stuck around. So that raises the question of, if you want to change these outcomes, what approach would you take? Well, I'm a psychologist. A political scientist might take a different approach, but as a psychologist, typically psychologists have tried to take the following approach. First, you identify the psychological process, the process that's happening within an individual person that you think causes the disparities. And then you try to figure out a way to change that psychological process. This approach, though, will only work if two conditions are satisfied. First, if the effects on that psychological process last over time. So if they fade, the disparity doesn't have a chance to change in an enduring way. And second, there actually has to be a link between the psychological process and the behaviors that are causing the disparities. If that link isn't robust, then changing the psychological process isn't going to do very much. Psychologists have proposed a number of different processes that might satisfy these two criteria. I'm going to focus on two of them. One is a process that's gained a lot of traction in the popular media, something called implicit bias. And the second one is a little bit more mundane, it's beliefs or knowledge. And I'll describe a little bit more about what I mean by these two things in a bit. So implicit bias came from, the idea behind implicit bias originated from the following observation. I just mentioned that a lot of these disparities have lingered over time since the civil rights movement. But if you look at controllable responses on national surveys, you see, since the start of the civil rights movement, consistent improvements in people's attitudes. So regardless of whether on a survey you ask whether, say, black people, should they attend the same schools, should they have the same job opportunities, should they use the same accommodations, across a variety of different ways of answering this question, people have consistently agreed to a greater extent with these different propositions. And these improvements have happened in spite of the fact that these disparities between black and white people have not changed as much. So that's led to the following logic. If it is the case that despite people's changes in their reported attitudes, their beliefs about whether black people and white people should have the same opportunities that probably means that if the beliefs aren't responsible for the disparities, there must be something else that's unrelated to people's beliefs that's not changing, and that's leading to for the disparities to stick around. So the process that has been proposed to cause these disparities is something called implicit bias. It's theorized to be automatically activated associations between concepts. And the key word here is automatic. It's something that happens in spite of your beliefs. The idea is that there's still a lot of stereotypic information. If you look at media and so forth, Black people are portrayed negatively, and people absorb that even if they don't necessarily believe that, say, Black people are more inherently criminal than white people. And the idea is that these automatic associations that just sort of get reactivated and reactivated and reactivated become almost like unwanted habits. They stick around even if you don't consciously endorse them. And the idea is that these automatic processes affect behavior even if you don't want them to, especially when you lack the motivation, awareness, and the ability to think about your responses. So it's kind of like, again, an unwanted habit. If I have a habit of biting my nails, I might bite my nails in a sort of nerve-wracking situation, even if I don't want to bite my nails because I think I look like an idiot. There are a lot of different ways to assess implicit bias. One of the most popular, which maybe some of you have taken this yourself, is called the implicit association test, or the IAT. The idea is that you're assessing people's reaction times to identify, say, a picture as a black or white picture, and a word as a positive or negative word. And when black and negative is paired together, you're a little bit faster and the task is a little bit easier than if black and positive are paired together. Like I said, there are a lot of these different tasks. This is definitely the most popular. And you can see how this might be something a little bit more unconscious, something that you don't have as much control over. And so it might be, this kind of task might bypass your conscious responses, your conscious beliefs. So we have a lot of evidence on people's responses on tasks like the IIT. And we also have done a bunch of studies where we measure the IIT alongside some forms of behavior. And the consistent finding is that people's scores on the IIT are associated with their different types of behavior. And there's some pretty large-scale, they're called meta-analyses. These are reviews of a bunch of different studies that cover a common topic. And the exact association between scores on the IIT and people's behavior varies a lot. But these are correlations. The correlation varies between about 0.14 to as high as 0.27. So the logic has been that, well, as long as these correlations affect or represent some sort of causal relationship, as long as these correlations are produced because implicit bias is causing people to behave in a certain way, this might indicate that relationship between a process and an outcome that I was talking about. And so if we can develop some sort of intervention, some sort of way to change people's levels of implicit bias, that might be an effective way of reducing social disparities. So this has led to widespread calls to develop implicit bias interventions. The Department of Justice has considered mandating implicit bias training for police officers. A lot of companies are very interested in implicit bias interventions as well. And this has led to a flurry of intervention research. There are tons of these studies out there. So my colleagues and I decided to assess the effectiveness of these implicit bias interventions. We did a meta-analysis, a review of all these different studies. In reflecting the scale of this research, this meta-analysis is really quite large. We reviewed over 300 articles, containing almost 500 studies and 571 samples. And a lot of people have been involved in this research. There are about 90,000 participants across this this body of studies. So it's really a quite large body of evidence. We categorize the different intervention approaches. So this is 11 different categories. I'm not going to talk about the intervention categories in a lot of detail, but these interventions range from everything from showing people pictures of famous black people and infamous white people. So think Barack Obama versus, I don't know, in some samples, Donald Trump. To telling people to try not to be biased when they take an IIT. So that's a pretty weak form of intervention, but some people have tested that to see if that changes people's responses on these tasks. In threat, this could be giving people feedback that they performed badly on an intelligence test. So this is, the idea would be that this might exacerbate levels of implicit bias. Another note that I'll make about these studies is that not all these studies involve race. In fact, not all these studies involve bias against people. Implicit bias has been a popular and broad enough topic that there's some alcohol research, for example. So the idea is that people's automatic responses to alcohol might be causing one of the causes behind how difficult it is to give up drinking. So what I'm going to show you is the degree to which each of these different intervention categories produces a change in these implicit tests, these things like the implicit association test. This on the x-axis is called the standardized mean difference. It's a way of measuring the size of the impact. And basically, the larger this is, the larger the effect on these different implicit tasks. Right here is the number of studies that tested a particular category of intervention. And this gives the actual value of the standardized mean difference. And this 0 in the center indicates no effect relative to basically doing nothing. So this is a lot of data, but you can see that a lot of these different categories of interventions seem to produce some sort of change on implicit tasks. So the idea here is that we have some different techniques that at least change people's responses on things like the IIT. The size of the effect varies, and we have, for some of these categories, we have less evidence than others. So we have 16 studies that test the effects of producing a positive mood. We have a lot of studies that have tried to directly change responses on these implicit tasks. That's things like showing people pictures of Barack Obama. A lot of studies have used that general approach. But yeah, there are a lot of different ways to change people's responses on things like the IIT. All right, so we have the interventions. We have some evidence that there's at least an association between people's responses on things like the IIT and their behavior. So let's apply the two criteria that I proposed at the beginning. Do these changes last? So do they last beyond, say, a single sitting? And second, if you change the implicit response, does that actually produce a change on the behavior? So I mentioned how this is a lot of samples of different where researchers have tested whether they can change implicit bias. And given the relevance, the potential relevance of this topic to things like hiring disparities, you think that a lot of these studies have tested whether the effects on these that they produce on implicit bias on the implicit association test last. And you'd be wrong. So across these 570 samples, only about 7% have actually tested whether the effects last beyond a single session. So this is actually an issue that we've barely even begun to test. We do have some large-scale evidence on this particular question. So my colleague Calvin Lai, who's the other lead author on the meta-analysis, tested this question of persistence in about 7,000 participants. So this is one very large study. And he took a bunch of these different interventions that I described, and for each one of them, he tested whether they produce an immediate effect on implicit bias and whether the effect lasts beyond 24 hours. So this isn't even a very strong test of persistence. This is just persistence across one day. So these are the exact interventions that he tested. Again, I'm not going to go through the detail, but there are a lot of them. Here are the immediate effects. Yeah, you can see a lot of these have some impact on what they measured in INT in this particular study. Here are the effects after 24 hours. This is no effect whatsoever. And you can see, without exception, across these different interventions, there's no evidence whatsoever of persistence beyond 1 day. And again, this is not a very strong test of whether these effects persist. So again, I'd say we haven't really begun to assess this question in detail, but the evidence that we do have, I think, is not hopeful. So let's look at the second criteria. In the meta-analysis that we mentioned, in addition to looking at the effects on implicit tasks, we also recorded whether the study assessed any sort of behavior whatsoever. We were pretty liberal with what we considered a behavior. So this ranged from everything from how closely someone chooses to sit to a black person after doing the intervention, to ratings of resumes, there were a few of those, to self-reported judgments of how likable people are. So it's a wide variety of different behaviors. And one thing that I'll direct your attention to is that these are, again, fairly far removed from things like, I don't know, whether black people get shot by cops. That's the problem that a lot of people want to solve through implicit bias interventions, but the research actually doesn't look at that outcome for the most part. But nevertheless, we looked at whatever evidence of change that they did have. So what I'm going to show you is a graph very similar to the one that I showed you before, except that in addition to showing the effects of these interventions on implicit bias, I'll also show their effects on behavior. And you can see a pretty consistent pattern across these different categories of interventions. This is the effect on implicit bias that I showed you before, and almost without exception, the effects on behavior are pretty small. And in fact, it's hard for us to say whether there is any effect whatsoever. These effects could be zero. We tested this more formally, whether there's evidence that there's a non-zero impact of these interventions on behavior. And well, first of all, we were able to say definitively that the effects were smaller than the effects on implicit bias. And we are not able to say that there's a non-zero effect. And I just want to linger on this particular result because to me it was really stunning. So this is a body of research that has been active for like 20 years. And we cannot even say with any certainty that any of these interventions have an impact on behavior. That's really not very optimistic. We can also ask, this is sort of a technical term. What I'm testing here is whether there's evidence that, let's assume that these interventions do have an impact on behavior. Is there evidence that that impact is caused by a change in implicit bias? That whatever effect on behavior that they have is due to a change in implicit bias? And this is, sort of the question that we want to know if we want to deploy this change in behavior. Is there a change that's caused by a change in implicit bias? And no, there's no evidence whatsoever that any change in behavior is due to a change in implicit bias. So despite about 20 years of research, we're not able to say with any certainty that implicit bias interventions have an effect on behavior. I want to emphasize again that there are very severe limitations in this body of literature. There's not much research on the question of persistence, and only about 15% of the studies measured any behavior whatsoever. But if you want to base policy on implicit bias interventions, this is not the kind of state of the research literature that you want to create good policy. So aside from looking at the exact evidence, there are actually some scientific theoretical reasons why you might not expect the effects on implicit bias to last or to generalize to behavior. So psychologists, they often think about how the different psychological processes are related to people's conceptions of themselves. And you can arrange these processes as being, or you can categorize these processes as being more central to how people view themselves and less central. So things like your values, they might form a large part of how you view yourselves, how a person views themselves. You might think of yourself as someone for whom equality is really important. That might be an example of value. Some processes might be a little bit less important to how you view yourself. So you might have a belief that the world is generally a fair place. Or maybe you have a belief that's not a fair place. That's definitely important to how a lot of people view themselves, maybe a little bit less so than your core values. And some processes are not very central to how people view themselves. And I would propose that one of these processes are these automatic processes, these things that happen behind the scenes. You need them to live your daily life, but they don't form a core part of your self-concept, of how you view yourself. So the implication of this structure of the self is that things that are really important to how you view yourself, things like values, those are really hard to change. Therapists have been working for a long time on ways to change people's core beliefs and their core values, and it's hard. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. But if you do manage to do it, if you manage to provoke a change in something that's really central to yourself, that's a change that lasts. So if you have a successful therapeutic experience, and you do provoke that change, that's probably going to resist other efforts to change those processes. Makes sense, you have to devote a lot of energy to changing it. That means that it would probably resist other energy to change it back. Processes that are less central to yourself, to the self, are more susceptible to change. They can get sort of buffeted around. But once you change those processes, they could just change right back. There's not a lot of other stuff that's tied to them that helps them resist those other external pressures to change. So, the implication for an intervention is that implicit bias, as I described, is an example of one of those automatic processes. The definition, actually, is these automatically activated associations between concepts. So people don't invest a lot of themselves in implicit bias. It's just a thing that is in the mind that might not be tied to a lot of the rest of the self-concept. What's more, I described implicit bias as this thing that you pick up from the structure of the external environment. There are a lot of different things like media influences and real-world patterns that reinforce people's levels of implicit bias. So the implication is that if I develop an intervention to change implicit bias, it might be easy to shift within one session, but then once someone leaves that session, it just goes right back to its original level. It gets buffeted around. This is precisely the kind of process that, based on this sort of model of the self, you might predict is easy to shift, but then hard to provoke a long-term change on. So if you're thinking about what to intervene on, what process within the self might provoke an effective change on something like social disparities, maybe you don't want to go here. Maybe this isn't the thing that you want to change because the changes are going to be ephemeral. They're not going to last. On the other hand, something like values might be too difficult to change within a single setting. You know, as I said, clinical psychologists have been thinking about how to change core values for a long time, and it's hard. It takes a lot of time and effort. So from the perspective of policy, maybe we want to go at this middle level, beliefs and knowledge. So this is the kind of thing that it might be a little bit difficult to get some change on. You know, it might take some work. But once you get it, it's not going to leave right away. So that's going to be what I'm going to focus on for the second half of the talk, is an approach to change knowledge. I'm going to focus on one particular intervention that I developed along with my PhD advisor and many other people. We call it the prejudice habit breaking intervention. The way this works is that the people who do the intervention take an implicit measure and get some feedback on their performance. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but the idea behind this is to provoke some sort of awareness. And they also go through a self-paced slideshow that educates people about race-related issues and how they come up and how people might be biased without realizing it. The slideshow is divided into an education section. So again, it describes how bias can occur without people realizing it, and a training section that compares unwanted bias to a habit that you can break if you use a variety of strategies. So the idea is that if you want to break a habit, you have to be motivated. So you have to believe that there's a problem to solve. You have to be aware of when you do the habit, and then you have to exert some effort to break the habit. So you might, from this description, you might be saying, well, wait a second, this sounds a lot like an implicit bias intervention. And yeah, that's why we originally developed it, actually. And in our first, we did one study where we purported to show that it did have an effect on implicit bias. So in this first study, people who received this prejudice habit breaking intervention had reduced scores on an IET that lasted over time. And the people who didn't receive the intervention their scores remained fairly stable. So we were really excited because, you know, I set up this whole thing about how there's not a lot of studies about persistence at all, and maybe this is a way to change scores on implicit bias. This is before I came to the opinion that changing implicit bias wasn't really a useful thing to do. So we did a bunch of other studies. In fact, we did 5 other studies besides this first one, spanning about 1,600 participants. So here's that first effect that I showed you, where we found a persistent change across 91 participants. Here are the others. This is the 0 mark. And you'll see that across these 5 replications, there was no impact of the intervention on implicit bias. So this was really discouraging. But, you know, if you take a step back and think about what the intervention is actually doing, you know, so we're describing how people can be biased without realizing it, and how that can create negative consequences across a variety of domains. And we're telling people, well, you know, if you use these strategies, you might be able to change whether you're unintentionally biased. Well, this isn't exactly changing implicit bias. This sounds more like an educational intervention. In fact, there's an education section. This is changing people's beliefs about how discrimination acts in society. So this is actually, it's focusing on something slightly different. This is focusing on people's beliefs about the world. Even though this doesn't produce any change on implicit bias per se, still might be having some other positive impacts that people might be carrying around with them after they leave the lab. So, this is really important. Instead of actually changing implicit bias per se, we're changing motivation and awareness, and we're leveraging those to produce an impact on behavior, on the effort that they exert to using some strategies. And in fact, we also, in these studies, measured something that might be associated with these beliefs that might tell us whether we're changing beliefs and not, rather than implicit bias. So we asked people to respond to questions like, I'm not personally concerned about racial discrimination. People need to stop focusing so much time and energy on discrimination, and I consider it to be a social problem. So these items seem to be measuring people's beliefs about racial discrimination. Is it something that we should be concerned about? Is it something that's prevalent in society? Is it something that we should be devoting some time and energy to? And in our first study, we did indeed see that people who received our intervention increased in their endorsement of these items, their endorsement of the fact that discrimination is a problem. And this is something that actually does hold up. This is the zero line, so you'll see across these 5 additional studies that we did, so about 1,600 participants, that there is a small but measurable impact of this habit-breaking intervention on people's beliefs that concern is a problem, or that discrimination is a problem. And what's also encouraging is that these concern about this discrimination, people's endorsement of these items that, yeah, discrimination is really a problem, is associated with things, with how the participants seem to understand the environment around them. So in one of these studies, we asked people to basically fill out diary entries every other day. And we had about 300 people do this. And we looked at these diary entries and coded them for whether people mentioned that someone else acted with bias, and whether they explicitly labeled the incident as something that was wrong. So one response that we coded as in this instance of mentioning someone else's bias is, oh, well, a friend was telling a joke about a black person. In this particular response, they didn't necessarily say that it was like a joke based on stereotypes, but I think that's probably reasonable to assume. And then an incident of labeling is, my roommate was on a website that had inappropriate jokes. She read one that played on the history of black people as slaves. It wasn't funny and it made me really uncomfortable. So this is an instance of both mentioning an instance of bias and then explicitly saying, hey, that wasn't good. And in this particular study, we found that people who did this habit-breaking intervention were both more likely to mention that other people acted with bias. So it's about 9% of the entries mentioning that someone acted with bias, and about 4% in the control group mentioning the same. And when they mentioned that someone else acted with bias, they were also more likely to label it as wrong. So just over 15% versus about 7%. So in each case, it's about a doubling of the probability. So this seems fairly encouraging. In all these studies, we're measuring something over time. So across these studies, it varies from about 2 weeks of persistence versus 2 months of persistence. That seems pretty good. And these are, and it seems to be changing something that is at that middle level of centrality to the self. So people's beliefs about bias in the world and whether that's a problem. So I'd say, based on this evidence, that the habit-breaking intervention passes my criterion 1. There's good evidence for persistence. So it's about 1,600 participants worth of evidence. And in each of these cases, there's at least two weeks worth of persistence. Okay, so let's apply my second criterion. Do the effects appear to generalize to behavior? I'm going to review two kinds of behavior. The first is from that same diary study that I mentioned. At the very end of the study, we measured whether people objected to bias in a public context. What we did was, this was 2 years after the initial study, we invited people to, these college students, to complete a survey about the student newspaper. And this was completely unrelated to our research team, where this was portrayed as unrelated to our research team. So what the respondents did was they read what we described as a student essay, and we allowed them to rate the essay and post a comment that they were told would be made public if they wanted to post a comment. And of the about 300 people, about 100 people did this follow-up survey, and about 82 people left a comment. This is the essay that the participants read. It was entitled "Stereotypes Are Useful Tools." It's basically arguing that people are too PC, and stereotypes are fine, there's nothing inherently wrong with them, they're just a simplifying tool. We based this on an actual essay that we found. And you see this kind of rhetoric on some websites, so it's not that far removed from what people would do in an everyday situation. They read editorials and respond to them. What we measured was whether the participants disagreed with the essay. So we coded their comments, again, for basically saying that, hey, I don't think that the person who wrote this essay is on base. Stereotypes can be wrong. This is an example of someone's response. It's pretty detailed, but you can see I just completely disagree that stereotypes are a useful indicator, and there's lots of evidence to the contrary. Not everybody wrote something this extensive, but some people did. An example of not disagreeing is, this would have quite a response from the student-based advocacy groups. It could start a negative reaction towards this is the student newspaper. Notice even though they're saying it might provoke a reaction, they're not necessarily saying, no, I think that this is wrong or off base. We found that people who had done the habit breaking intervention were much more likely, about 80% of the responses said, no, I think this is wrong, versus just over 50% in our control group. So again, this is 2 years later. It's a pretty strong test of persistence, and it seems like this particular approach is passing the test. The other source of evidence is from a study of faculty at the University of Wisconsin. The thing that we assessed is whether people targeted by our intervention actually took steps to do something. So remember in our intervention we were specifically saying, if you think this is a problem, you can do things. You can use strategies to change the problem. That's really at the core of what the message behind the habit breaking intervention. So the study involved over 2,000 faculty from 92 academic departments. It was all the academic departments at the University of Wisconsin. And we had assigned the departments to matched pairs. So they were matched basically based on the nature of the department and the number of women in the department. So for example, physics was matched with engineering. We did our best to make sure that the departments were relatively similar. The experimental departments were invited to a version of the habit breaking intervention that consisted of a workshop. in the workshop, instead of being targeted on race like the other studies that I've mentioned, this was targeted to the problem of women in STEM. And so we basically took people through the habit-breaking intervention but applied all the same principles to gender bias in STEM rather than a general race-based intervention. One thing that's important here is that we couldn't mandate that everybody in the experimental departments would come to the workshop that we held. And in fact, only about 31% of the faculty in the experimental departments actually did attend. So the study that we did took place about 3 years after this initial workshop. And we did a follow-up survey and also pulled some HR records both before the workshop and after the workshop. And what we were most interested in was whether the workshop would change the proportion of new hires who were women. And we also had some measures in the follow-up survey. We had the measures took place at a couple different levels. One that we were especially interested in was who was active on things like hiring committees. So we asked people to identify the other people in their departments who they had worked with on things like hiring committees and curricular activities, basically setting departmental policy. And so if I'm at the University of Arkansas right now, these are all the people at the University of Arkansas. If I were taking this measure, I would literally just select the people with whom I had worked with on, say, hiring committees. Finally, we also, in our survey 3 years later, we also asked people, hey, when you were on these hiring committees and so forth, were you taking steps to address gender bias? And so again, our primary outcome, the thing that we were most interested in was this affecting the proportion of new hires who were women? That really the proof is in the pudding. That's the main thing that we wanted to address. But through this measure of departmental collaboration and the survey outcomes, that might provide some insight into if there is a change, how's that actually occurring? So I'll show you the main outcome first. This is just the probability that a new hire was a woman in the 2-year period before the intervention and the 2-year period afterwards. And so what you see is that in the control and experimental departments, the number of new hires who were women was pretty similar. This makes sense. We had actually made an effort to match the departments on things like gender composition. In the control departments, there was basically no change in the proportion of new hires were women. In the experimental departments, there was a reasonable shift. So this is about a 14 percentage point change, which I think is pretty good. This is basically gender fair hiring. One thing that's interesting about this change, though, is that I mentioned only about 30% of the people in the experimental departments actually attended the workshop. So we're not changing everybody. So the question is, how is that happening? We only have a couple people in each department who have the potential to be influenced by the intervention. They must be doing something in their departments to provoke this larger change across all of the hires. So what is that? So to try to understand that, I looked at that sociometric measure, that measure of who's working with whom on things like hiring committees. From that question, I can create these network graphs of This is one of the departments in our study. And each of these nodes represents a single faculty member. And I just put an arrow so this arrow indicates that this person said, yeah, I've worked with this person on hiring committees. This allows us to know who's working with a lot of people on departmental issues and who's really disengaged in departmental issues. So this is that same department that I just showed you. And this is just showing you at broad scale what these different collaboration networks look like. You can see that some of them, not a lot of people are doing departmental stuff, and there are a lot of disengaged people in this particular department. There are a lot of nodes that are saying they're not working with anybody, and then there are some that are really engaged. And also within these departments, people vary a lot in how engaged they are in departmental affairs. So we tested whether there's a change overall in the departmental networks. Is it the case that we're making the networks denser? We're causing people to collaborate more on departmental issues? And the answer was no. There's not really a difference. So what I'm showing you now is the people who actually attended our workshop. Each of these red dots is a person who attended the workshop. And it sort of seems like the red dots are concentrated in the center of these networks. They're basically collaborating with a lot more on departmental issues. That would actually make sense because we're presenting this as a workshop that is relevant to academic affairs, academic policy. So it would make some sense if the people who happen to attend our workshop were more involved in departmental issues. And yeah, they were. So they were much more likely to be nominated as someone that was working on things like hiring committees. Well, if that's the case, then it could be that these people, these departmental attenders, are channels of influence. They're a route to produce larger, broader change in these departments. So each of these blue dots represents someone who collaborated with a departmental attender, a potential channel of influence. And what we did was we just compared people's responses on this question of, I was in departmental in hiring committees and so forth. I spoke up about gender-related issues. So the people in the control departments, they weren't agreeing or disagreeing on this question. People who were not connected to a tender looked pretty similar to people in the control group. Interestingly, the attenders also didn't look like the control group. It could be that they had a different standard when they were answering that question. I'm not sure. But what's interesting is that the people who were connected to an attender said, yeah, I did a bit more to work on departmental issues. The reason this is so interesting is that, for one thing, this happened 3 years after we did the workshop. And these are, it could be that the attenders were a way to produce broader change within these structures. So they were highly placed in these departments. They may have been made more aware and motivated to do something to address gender bias. And then they leveraged those positions to provoke broader change in, say, hiring practices and policies, and that influenced their colleagues. We don't know that, but one thing that I am confident about with these results is that, we had a lot of people involved, and this is a strong test of persistence. So that makes me at least reasonably confident that this is a reasonable approach to changing broader disparities. So I'd say, yeah, if we were going back to the criteria that I presented at the beginning of the talk, this is reasonable evidence that the effects of this intervention persist and generalized behavior. And I think it's It's also pretty clear that however it is that this approach is changing behavior, it's not doing it through implicit bias per se. It's doing it through knowledge, something that people carry around with them, and that might be more likely to endure once you provoke the change. So going back to the original topic of the talk, I covered a lot of ground, but I hope I've convinced you that whatever it is that implicit bias interventions do, they probably don't last, or at least the evidence is equivocal. And I think they're relatively unlikely to generalize behavior. And I base that conclusion both on the evidence that I showed you and on that theory of the self that I presented. Implicit bias is this process that's not central to the self. But once you provoke the change, it's likely to just go right back to where it was once someone leaves the lab. I think this category of intervention that I'm calling a knowledge-based intervention is a better way to go. The prejudice habit-breaking intervention, the thing that I focused on for this talk, that's just one example that you could use. I don't think it's the only one, but I do think that it might be a fruitful way to go. And above all, in general, when we're evaluating interventions, I think we should focus on persistence. So one of the reasons I'm a little bit more optimistic about the habit-breaking intervention is that we put it to some strong tests. We've studied the effects of the habit-breaking intervention over time, as long as 3 years later. We've done the work to try to see whether it's not just a change that you can provoke in one lab session, but it's a change that lasts over some period of time. I think we should also study the behaviors that we actually care about. So that's another thing that we did with the habit-breaking intervention. We studied things like faculty hiring. We also studied things like objections on editorials. I think that's a thing that matters. So when we're evaluating these interventions, we shouldn't get too caught up in any one metric. We should think about the things that we actually care about, the things that we want to provoke change on, and actually measure those. And finally, I think we should focus on processes that have a reasonable chance to last. That's one of my biggest problems with implicit bias interventions. Theoretically, that's just not something that I would expect to last once you've changed it. I'm more optimistic about things like knowledge. I don't even necessarily think that we always have to take a psychological approach to these interventions. I think direct changes to policy, those are changes that last too. Whatever it is that we're changing, it should be something that at least has a reasonable chance to persist. I had a lot of help with doing all this research, and I definitely should not take all the credit. So these are all my collaborators. Thanks, and I welcome any questions that you have.
Conducting the studies, did you guys ever compare, let's say, between two different age groups, if it was more effective among younger participants versus older? Or?
Yeah, most of the research that we've done so far has been with college students.
Oh, good.
I can't say necessarily whether I know that would be more effective with younger or older people. We haven't tested this with children, for example. The faculty study, of course, that's using, the participants there are people who are faculty age, and generally they're going to be older. That's an interesting question. With this, if you get someone who's younger, is it more effective? Maybe. I think that's a reasonable hypothesis, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
developed the motivations to express prejudice, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that this knowledge intervention had an effect on those who are voicing motivations to express prejudice?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So some of my other research concerns people who, for whom expressing negative views about specific groups is a core part of their self-concept. So it's intended, I have a measure that assesses whether people believe that expressing negative views is important to them. You know, that's something that I think taps these values. And based on the model that I presented, I think that would be pretty hard to change. I haven't done any intervention research yet to test that. I'd be very interested to know, you know, how do you reach people who, for whom saying negative things about a particular group is a core part of their, you know, political ideology or whatever. I think that's a fantastic question. I'd love to know the answer. I don't know the answer. I think it would be hard though.
In terms of practice, what recommendations might you offer to a school or district leader who is concerned about racially disparate outcomes and thinks that they may at some level be, you know, rooted in bias?
Yeah, so for one thing, identify clearly the outcomes that you want to change. Don't get too caught up in things like the implicit association test. You know, there's a lot of rhetoric and editorials about implicit bias and implicit bias interventions. We had that the incident at Starbucks, and Starbucks saying, "Oh yeah, you know, we're going to do implicit bias training." I think that's a wrong-headed approach. If you want to change how customers are treated, you ought to be assessing how customers are treated in your company. It seems kind of obvious, but somehow it's not. So that's the first step, is actually identifying the outcomes that you want to change and developing some way to measure them. The second piece of advice that I could give is I don't think the changes are likely to last unless you provoke changes in things that are likely to last. So that would be things like policy. If you're an academic department and you want to improve the diversity of your hires, well, you should probably be changing your policies around how you hire people. Again, it seems like that should be obvious, and yet a lot of people don't do that. I also think, you know, educating people could be a useful approach. So, you know, there could be some form of training out there that might provoke a longer change because you're changing people's knowledge about these issues, and you know, they carry that around with them, and you know, that causes them to behave differently when they're interacting with customers. So I think that could be useful too, but I think it's probably going to be more effective if it's coupled with some sort of policy change. Yeah.
This intervention was implemented amongst faculty in a university, typically a high level of education and investment in developing education regarding current issues. Do you think that the education is a moderator of that effect? And my example being with this extremely to an organization like a finance company or a bank where they're having the same issue, but there's not specifically an emphasis on education of financial outcomes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. A lot of our evidence was with college students, and most of them are in their first year. You know, in order to get to college, they probably have to come from a family that has some amount of resources, and so we're still dealing with people with more education than is typical. I am working with a police department to develop a police-oriented version of the habit-breaking intervention. The officers, a lot of them have a college education, but not all do. So we might be able to assess that in that context. I think it's reasonable to believe, you know, education has a liberalizing influence. Being more liberal is associated with more positive attitudes about equality and those sorts of issues. So it might be reasonable to expect that education plays some role here. I'm not sure exactly what though.
Whoever else was. So as a quick follow-up, would that be a good direction for follow-up research or exploring?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question. And I don't know, but it seems reasonable that would play a role, yeah.
Could you go back to the slide with the attenders versus those who are connected to the attenders? Okay, just a question. So you had mentioned the attenders might have been using a different standard. Do you think maybe they were focused more, everyone else is focused on the times I did do something, they were focused more on the times I didn't do something than I should have? So
Oh.
now that's where the standard has changed, is they've become more aware of the times they were silent. And
Yeah,
that's what's more evident to them now instead of the times they just.
it's a really good idea. I mean, there is some evidence that if you ask people about how much progress we've made towards achieving racial equality, people who are, for whom equality is more important to them, it's a more central value, they tend to focus on how far we have yet to go, whereas people for whom it's less important tend to focus on how far we've come. So that would be consistent with that.
Yeah, that it's, I'm not as far as I should be.
Right, yeah,
So
it's
the
good
same
thought.
thing. Okay. Any other questions? No. Well, thank you everyone for being here.